Dragon Ball Super introduced us to a lot of new forms, like a ton of them. Goku alone has more forms than people even realize, and Vegeta got some more of his own as well. You also know it's kind of a big deal because even Piccolo got forms. Not just one, but he got two brand new ones within the same movie, after all this time of never even having a real transformation. I've done a video similar to this before, but it was a while back, and I feel like there's a potential for a fun discussion here if we refine it more and include a lot of the newer stuff. Plus, if I get better editing and audio. That's always a plus. Last time we pretty much only covered Saiyan forms. And I feel like my answer was kind of a cop-out because I ended by saying grade 3 was the worst form. And that kind of was an obvious answer, but does it even really count? Like, we only see it used by Trunks as a bluff, and Caulifla who doesn't even know any better. No one actually makes use of this in a fight in Super. So I feel like the answer is kind of unsatisfying, and that's why we're going to do it differently here. I also didn't specify Saiyan forms either. We could actually include a few others too. And we're also going to ignore things like grade 2 or grade 3 of Super Saiyan, since we don't see them used anymore and they were basically stepping stones to Super Saiyan grade 4 and Super Saiyan 2. And the title here is going to be fixing every DBS form, but I'll come right out and say we're not fixing every single form there, because otherwise I'd be here all day talking about people like Frost who we barely see, and people that you guys probably don't even remember or care about, like Tupper, since there's a lot of randoms in the tournament and power that have their own transformations too. We're going to focus mainly on the forms that got a lot of screen time. And I do want to make it clear, this isn't based on my thoughts on how the forms work narratively. It's based on the feasibility of each form, the upsides that come with it, as well as the downsides. Furthermore, it's not going to be based just on power alone, otherwise the answer would just be obvious. It would be whatever form has the weakest power increase. We're just looking at these forms from a standpoint of which form provides the most disadvantages, rather than which one is the weakest, and comparing those disadvantages to the upsides of the form too. So what are the upsides and downsides to each of these forms, and how could we fix them if needed? And most importantly, which form is the worst as it is now? Let's begin. We have kind of a random order here, but I'm going to kind of go up the chain, starting at the more basic ones, then going to the more complex ones. First, we have the form that Broly used, the Wrathful or Akari form, whatever you want to call it. This one's honestly pretty bad. I like the concept of it, but again, we're talking from a feasibility standpoint, and this form, well, it doesn't even really work that well. Besides it being immediately phased out, it's pretty useless right now unless Broly combines it with something else. Broly does grow while he fights in it, but that's not necessarily because of the form itself, it's more so just because that's how Broly works, even in base. It sent Broly into a blind rage, and maybe someone like Vegeta could control it better, since he actually does know how to control the grade 8 form. But from what we saw with Broly, this one is tough to access, tough to use, and doesn't really provide much benefits besides a little bit of a boost in power. There's not really a point for anyone else to get it, but it's not necessarily horrible either. Next we'll go with the most iconic form of the series, Super Saiyan. There's not really any flaws with it. It was perfected long ago, and there's nothing to change about it. The same goes for Super Saiyan 2. Thankfully we do see these forms a little bit still, more so Super Saiyan, but I'm honestly kind of surprised that Super Saiyan 2 isn't the default by now because, functionally at least for Goku and Vegeta, they work pretty effortlessly with Super Saiyan 2, which is really just a better Super Saiyan. And now we have the Universe 6 Saiyans using Super Saiyan 2 as well, so we'll be seeing more of it in the future. But in terms of Goku and Vegeta, there's not really any downsides for either of these forms. Besides the obvious lack of power, but we're not basing it just on that. So in the context of this video, these forms are flawless as they are now. But in the main Super Saiyan line of transformations, Super Saiyan 3 comes next, so we could talk all day about this form. The design of it, how it works narratively, and how the form works in general. But this form has a pretty bad drawback that never was fixed. It's pretty impractical even to this day. A good analogy that I used before of it is a balloon. Super Saiyan 3 is like a balloon that you could try to keep filling it up, but that balloon has a small hole in it, so no matter how much you keep pumping air into it, it'll never reach its full capacity because you can never fit all of that air inside of it. It's always going to leak a little bit out. When Goku was dead, or just in a place where time doesn't flow normally, yeah, it's helpful, but in the living world, it seems this form isn't too useful, unless you can't access any higher forms. So if Caulifla ever ends up getting it, maybe it'll be good for her, just really as a short burst of power. But the only person who really gets any use out of it now is Gotenks, and we barely see him either. And it doesn't seem to be a perfect form for him as well. Now we could branch out a little bit more. There's Kale's Berserk form, and in a similar light, we have Broly's full power Super Saiyan form. And can I just say it's so weird how they distinguish these? Like, they're all clearly references to the legendary Super Saiyan form, but they're all named differently. In Kale's case, she at least did control her form, but it looks like she still does have access to that Berserk power. And while it does provide a ton of power for her, and that power continuously grows, the big issue is it's uncontrollable, and if her power keeps increasing, eventually she can cause unneeded damage with the lack of control, or probably just explode from the overflowing power. As for Broly, his full power Super Saiyan form doesn't seem to work too differently from his regular Super Saiyan form, since he had no control there as well. And assuming it does work similarly to Kale's, he could probably get control of it one day, and use it as effortlessly as his normal Super Saiyan form. Really, the only downside with these two is anger. If you can't control your anger properly, well, you just go berserk, and lose all sense of rationality. That is a pretty major downside, but that's also kind of the point of both these forms too, at least in the sense of Super. And it's important to distinguish that because Z Broly's works a little bit differently. So I guess the distinction of Legendary, Berserk, and Full Power Super Saiyan is kind of necessary, but also, why? Why is there so much going on with these forms? And why does Chaos have multiple names? And each of them have their own Super Saiyans and Super Saiyan 2s as well. But just make it regular. I don't want to go off topic anymore with these. Next up, we have Super Saiyan God, and just like Super Saiyan, this form is actually pretty flawless. There isn't really any downside to this form. It's got perfect stamina, it can be used at its full power all the time, and it even has use to this day. That's exactly why we still see it in fights, even alongside Super Saiyan Blue with the God to Blue switch, which is both in the manga and anime. The way Goku uses it in the Tournament of Power kind of highlights this. He could attack with the full power of Super Saiyan God, which doesn't speed him up, but since he could use 100% of the power in that form, he does gain a lot of speed from using it and doesn't really use too much of his energy. And using it in tandem with Blue is great. So I have no problems with Super Saiyan God, and there's not really a big downside with that, or any for that matter. Then there's Super Saiyan Blue, which by this point, it's similar to Super Saiyan God. Dragon Ball Super almost seemed unsure about whether this form had stamina issues or not, but it seems like we're way past that now. It may run out faster than Super Saiyan God just because of the fact that it does use more power, but it's pretty good nowadays. To the point where Goku can even stack Kaioken on it too for extra power. And that does have its own downsides, but that's because of the Kaioken technique, not because of the Blue form, so we don't really count that. Most of the kinks with Blue have been worked out by now. There is also the manga's version with perfected Super Saiyan Blue, which is a little bit harder to control if you're trying to keep all the ki inside of it, but again, that seems like an issue that's been corrected by now. I guess really the only downside is you have to practice with this form a lot to get a full control of it, but as of now, no real downsides. And we also got some honorable mentions here. There's Super Saiyan Rage and Super Saiyan Blue Evolution. The reason I'm not really talking more about these forms is because there's not too much to talk about. I'm including them here because they are notable, but at the same time, there's nothing that we really know about them. Like father, like son, they just both get unexplained forms. The names are self-explanatory, at least for them. They're very meathead forms, all we know is that they're just strong, and exist for some reason. And now we're going to go outside of Saiyan forms too. Let's start with Ultimate, or Power Awakening in Piccolo's case. It's worth mentioning this because Dragon Ball Super did change how this form works, and we do have two variants now. In Z, it almost seemed like this was just a permanent state for Gohan, but GT actually was the first to just remove it for him completely and show that it isn't a permanent state, and Super kind of followed that logic too. Although in Super, we actually do see him use this form a fair amount, but it works more like a transformation for Gohan now, which is exactly why I'm listing it here. As for Piccolo, that definitely also works like a transformation, but he seems to use it better than Gohan, and his was also accessed in a different way. And it might also work differently due to his biology, but we still don't really know too much about his version of it yet, and how truly similar it is to Gohan's. And while they do have the same principle, the forms may actually work a bit differently. As of the recording of this, the manga hasn't gotten to these events yet, so maybe we'll learn more when it does get to that point. But Piccolo seems to not have the same downside as Gohan's. The only real downside is that it's immediately outshined by Orange. But let's discuss what I mean. So in Gohan's case, we see that this form actually does have a few new downsides now. First of all, it's hard to access if you slack off with it. He lost access to it in the beginning of the series. And in Superhero, it seems like he needed a catalyst to get it back again. We don't know for sure if he truly lost it, but likely he did. Plus, this form seems to drain more energy now, evidenced by Gohan transforming out of it in Superhero, because in that final fight, he decides to fight in Super Saiyan instead when he's a little bit worn out, only turning Ultimate again after he got that Senzu Bean, which is strange because the form never really seemed to work this way before. Even in the Tournament of Power, we didn't see much of this. Same goes for the Buu Saga. Gohan actually stayed in the Ultimate the whole time during the Buu Saga after he got it, and he used it pretty effortlessly in the Tournament of Power and was pretty much in it the entire time. And another downside that wasn't there before, this form doesn't tap into your full potential anymore apparently, evidenced by Beast existing. The whole point of this before was the fact that it unlocks all your potential, but now, that's kind of a moot point considering Gohan has a stronger form beyond it. It's not necessarily a downside, but a change that makes the form not as great as it was before. Although I guess an explanation for this is the fact that Gohan probably never got his potential fully unlocked by Elder Kai, but that's kind of all speculation. We still don't really know much about the Beast form either, which by extension affects the Ultimate form too. And now let's cover the big two, Ultra Ego and Ultra Instinct. Let's start with Ultra Ego. One big downside is that it grows by being attacked. And people have assumed that's the only way for it to grow, but that's kind of a misconception. If that were a case, I'd say it's the worst form regardless, because that's a really bad downside. And that downside definitely is still there, but Ultra Ego grows from that, as well as just growing during battle. Vegeta says it grows from his battle spirit flaring up, which means the hornier Vegeta gets for battle, the stronger he grows. Although it seems like dealing damage to him actually does have more of an effect, which is a pretty huge downside, but it's not the only way for the power to grow, so that's worth mentioning. The form does have its upsides too. Being able to fully harness the destructive energy of a destroyer, it's pretty useful in battle because it can be used offensively and defensively, since the unique power of it can be used to just destroy attacks before they even hit you, assuming your enemy isn't strong enough. And on the flip side, we have Ultra Instinct. And I think the Granola arc kind of makes this form especially convoluted because it was pretty straightforward before. We used to just have Omen in the complete Ultra Instinct, But now we have Omen, the quote-unquote complete Ultra Instinct, and then the true Ultra Instinct, which is just Goku going back into Omen and using his emotions, trying to get a new state of it. Plus, Goku can also use Ultra Instinct as a technique while in other forms. Also, much like Ultimate, this form was once one that people debated about whether or not it's actually a form or just a technique, and now it's kind of considered both. It could be used as either, which is worth mentioning because I'm focusing on the transformations itself, not the actual technique. I have my own opinions on how this is handled narratively, but that would require its own video at this point. So from an objective standpoint, what are the upsides and downsides? Well, the upsides are pretty obvious. Your body moves automatically, both defensively and offensively. And at least for how it worked before, it leaves you motionless in the face of battle, which is good because it means you're basically only focused on that. But there are some downsides now. First of all, the complete version of it requires the right mindset to use its full power, at least as of now. And it's also pretty hard to master. Goku still hasn't mastered it yet after all this time. He has the complete version of it, but he hasn't fully gained a control on it. Like Super Saiyan, for example. Also, according to Whis, he's basically at the bottom of the rung and there's multiple stages beyond it that he could access, which probably does explain some of its downsides. And it still does seem to have a lot of stamina issues. Despite Goku's better control in it, it's apparent that he just can't use this infinitely. And while we're on the topic of non-Saiyan exclusive forms, let's talk about two others, Beast and Orange. Simply put, we have no clue about how these work. Orange probably drains power a bit faster since Piccolo didn't use it again until the very end of the movie, and stuck in his power awakened state for most of the time. But besides that, we don't really have any clues of how these forms work. And honestly, we still don't really have any clue of how Beast is accessed, or even about the exclusivity of it. So it's kind of hard to cover the downsides and upsides of these forms, but I'm mentioning here because people will probably be wondering why I'm excluding them. But that pretty much covers all the big ones. So which one is the worst? I have 3 different answers. My first one is a pretty obvious pick, Super Saiyan 3. There's not really any advantage with it since no one bothers to use it anymore. By this point, if you truly do need a power beyond Super Saiyan 2, at least for Goku and Vegeta, they could just jump into Super Saiyan God. Not like Vegeta's been shown to access Super Saiyan 3 anyways. My second pick is actually the Ultimate form. Not because this form is necessarily bad, but it was actually made worse by Superhero. I love the form, but I think I kind of got shafted a bit. It didn't seem to have too many downsides before, but it seems to be made actively worse by that movie. From a functional standpoint, and also a narrative standpoint, which requires its own video. And then I also think Ultra Ego is worth mentioning as probably kind of the bad form. Even though I did defend it, I still think the fact that it needs to get hit to get stronger is kind of a stupid downside. It's not the only way for it to grow stronger, but still, that's such a terrible downside for a form. Sure, the boost in power is worthwhile, but what's the point if you're taking so much damage that you can't fight anymore? Because that seems like the most effective way to power the form up. And while the whole battle spirit thing is explained too, it doesn't seem to be as effective. So now I open the floor to you. Which form do you think is the worst? Not from a narrative standpoint, not from a design standpoint, but just from a functional standpoint. Do you agree with any of my 3 picks, or do you think it's something completely different? Let me know in the comments below. It is a discussion video after all, so let's start discussing. Just keep it civil. If you like the video, be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already, especially because it helps out the channel a lot, and it tells me you want to see more like this. And as usual, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on my next video.